Reality Case Studies, Season 2, Jesse Lally and Michelle Saniei from the Valley. Episode 1, Why is he like that with her? Watching your ex become the partner you begged them to be. Grief, intermittent reinforcement, and the psychology of the chase. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie Buckley. I'm a parenting strategist and family systems coach who specializes in ADHD, executive functioning challenges, emotional regulation, and the patterns that keep families stuck in the same arguments on repeat. I'm also a mom to a thriving 23-year-old neurodivergent son with ADHD, and I've been married for over 3 decades. I created this podcast because I remember how confusing parenting felt when my son was younger. I remember watching behaviors that didn't make sense and wondering whether what I was seeing was attitude, laziness, defiance, or something else entirely. What I eventually learned, both through my professional work and my own kitchen table experience, is that many behaviors we interpret as intentional are actually rooted in how the brain processes stress, frustration, and executive functioning demands. This podcast exists to translate what is happening neurologically, psychologically, and relationally so that you can move from constant conflict to collaboration. I'm a solution-focused therapist, and I utilize Bowen family systems theory to help people understand the patterns running through their family system, which means my job is not to dwell on everything that's wrong. My job is to help you see the pattern clearly and then find the smallest workable change that moves your family toward peace. Today we're launching something I'm truly excited about, Season 2 of Reality Case Studies. Season 1 followed Amanda Batula and Kyle Cook from Summer House as we explored attachment, emotional safety, trust, and the psychology of repair. This season, we're moving over to the Valley, and we're going to follow the story of Jesse Lally and Michelle Saniei. A marriage, a separation, a divorce that played out on camera, and now a co-parenting relationship unfolding in front of millions while both of them build new lives with new partners. And I want to start this season not with the divorce itself, but with a single moment. Because sometimes one moment on a reality show captures a psychological experience so universal that it stops us in our tracks. This is one of those moments. But before we step into it, I want to take a few minutes to explain why this series exists at all. Because the method matters, and I want you to understand exactly what we are doing here and what we are not. Why case studies? Why reality TV? The method behind this series. When I call these episodes case studies, I'm choosing those words deliberately because the case study is one of the oldest and most respected teaching tools in the history of psychology and medicine. Long before we had brain scans and randomized trials, clinicians learned by studying one story deeply. Medical students still learn this way today. You can memorize the definition of a condition from a textbook and forget it by Friday, but walk through one real person's story, and you remember it for the rest of your career. That's because the brain is not built to store abstractions. It is built to store stories. Researchers call this narrative learning, and the findings are consistent. Information delivered inside a story is understood more deeply and remembered far longer than the same information delivered as a list of facts. When I give you the definition of intermittent reinforcement, you nod. When I show you a man pouring affection into a partner who returns it unpredictably, while the wife who gave it consistently stands 20 feet away, you never forget it. There's a second reason, and it comes from psychologist Albert Bandura's research on observational learning, which is the finding that people learn behaviors, patterns, and consequences by watching others, not only through their own direct experience. This is one of the brain's most powerful learning channels. It is how children learn most of what they know about relationships, by watching the adults in their home. And here's what I want you to sit with. It never turns off. As adults, we are still learning relational patterns from what we watch. So the question is not whether we learn from reality television. We do, whether we intend to or not. The question is whether we learn passively, absorbing drama with no framework, or actively, with someone handing us the psychological vocabulary to understand what we're actually seeing. This series exists to turn passive watching into active learning. The third reason is the most clinically important, and it's about something called psychological distance. Here is a truth every therapist and coach knows. It is far easier to see a pattern in someone else's life than in your own. That's not a character flaw. It's how our defenses work. When a pattern is ours, our brain has spent years building justifications around it because seeing it clearly would be painful. Psychologists call these defense mechanisms the automatic mental strategies we all use to protect ourselves from uncomfortable truths. But when the same pattern belongs to a stranger on a screen, our defenses stand down. There is nothing to protect. So we watch a woman ask for something reasonable and watch the request get flipped back on her. And we think, clear as day, that's not right. And then, sometimes days later, quietly, in the car or in the shower, comes the second thought, wait, that happens to me. That moment is the entire purpose of this series. The distance is not a limitation of this method. The distance is the method. The fourth reason is that reality television gives us something almost nothing else in public life gives us: longitudinal observation. Longitudinal simply means watching the same people over a long period of time rather than in one snapshot. A viral clip shows you a moment. A reality show, filmed across years, shows you a pattern, and patterns are the entire currency of family systems work. We have watched Jesse and Michelle meet the cameras as a married couple, struggle, separate, divorce, and now co-parent across multiple seasons. In Bowen family systems theory, the framework at the heart of my work, we understand that no behavior exists in isolation. Every behavior is part of a repeating sequence within a system, and you cannot identify a sequence from a single data point. Reality TV, for all its editing and production, is one of the only places in our culture where millions of us have watched the same relationship system move through time together. That makes it an extraordinary shared classroom. And that word, shared, is the fifth reason. When I use a story you watched with your own eyes, something powerful becomes possible. You saw the scene, you had a reaction to it. Maybe something about it bothered you and you couldn't name why. That's where my training comes in. After years of clinical education and thousands of hours sitting with families, couples, and individuals, I've developed what every experienced clinician develops: trained pattern recognition. I don't just see a tense conversation at a cast party. I see a boundary request, a deflection, an unanswered need, and a system protecting itself, because I've watched those exact sequences play out in real families over and over again. When we use footage we've both seen, I get to do something I could never do with a private client's story. I can point directly at the moment and walk you through it, frame by frame, the way an attending physician walks students through a case. You bring the scene you watched. I bring the clinical lens that took years to build. And together, that's how you start developing the ability to recognize these patterns yourself, first on a screen and eventually in your own living room. Now, the responsibilities that come with this method, because there are real ones, and I will repeat this every episode this season. We are watching edited television, produced for entertainment, and we are seeing only what the people involved and the producers have chosen to show. Nothing in this series is a psychological evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment recommendation for any individual discussed. I have never met, assessed, or worked with Jesse, Michelle, Lacy, or anyone else featured on the Valley. So let me say this very clearly. I am not diagnosing Jesse, Michelle, Lacy, or anyone else, and I never will on this series. A diagnosis requires hours of assessment, a full history, and a real relationship with a real client, and none of that exists here. What I do instead is describe patterns, the observable sequences anyone can verify from the footage. A request was made, a counter grievance came back, the request was never answered. The people on our screens are never our patients. They are our shared text, the way a literature class studies a novel. And the step that separates a case study from gossip is what we do next. We turn every single pattern back toward our own lives. If an episode of this series ends and you're thinking about Jesse and Michelle, I've failed. If it ends and you're thinking about your marriage, your parents' marriage, your co-parenting dynamic, or the way you learned to earn love as a child, then the case study did exactly what case studies have done for 100 years. Okay, now let's step into the moment. The scene, watching him be the partner you begged him to be. If you've been watching this season of The Valley, you've seen it. Jesse and Michelle are divorced now. They're co-parenting their daughter. And they are still filming together, which means Michelle doesn't get what most people get after a divorce, which is distance. Instead, she stands at cast parties and watches her ex-husband with his girlfriend, Lacy. And what she watches is affection, attentiveness, the hand on the back, the softness. And you can see it all over Michelle's face, because here is the sentence underneath her expression, the sentence so many people have said through tears. All I ever wanted was for him to be like that with me. Think about what Michelle lived through in that marriage, at least the version we saw on camera. She described a relationship where the spark had gone out, where she was asking for connection and not receiving it, where they become more like roommates than partners. She has told us, in her own words on the show, how much physical affection and closeness mattered to her. She worked alongside him in real estate. She built a life with him, gave him a daughter, stood in front of cameras defending the marriage while it was dissolving underneath her. And now she watches him hand another woman, apparently effortlessly, the exact currency she spent years asking for. So the first question of this episode is the question I know some of you are living right now. What is that pain psychologically? And why does it sometimes hurt even more than the divorce itself? Naming the pain. Part 1. Disenfranchised grief. The first term I want to give you is disenfranchised grief. This concept, introduced by grief researcher Kenneth Doka, describes grief that isn't socially recognized or validated. It is loss that the world around you doesn't give you permission to mourn. When your spouse dies, people bring casseroles. When your ex-husband falls in love with someone new and treats her beautifully, nobody brings a casserole. In fact, people often say the opposite. Why do you care? You're divorced. You left. You have a new boyfriend. You should be over it. But grief doesn't take instructions from a divorce decree. Michelle, and anyone in her position, isn't necessarily grieving Jesse the man. She may be grieving something much more specific and much more disorienting. Naming the pain. Part 2. Grieving the relationship that never existed. Here's the second concept, and it's one of the most important in this entire episode. Psychologists sometimes talk about grieving the hoped-for relationship, which means mourning not what you had, but what you kept believing was possible. This is closely related to what family therapist Pauline Boss calls ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is a loss without closure, where the person is still physically present, but the relationship you needed from them never materialized. Ambiguous loss is the grief of adult children with emotionally unavailable parents. It's the grief of partners of people in active addiction. And it is absolutely the grief of watching your ex-husband alive and well and standing 20 feet away from you at a cast party, giving someone else the version of himself you spent a marriage waiting for. When Michelle watches Jesse with Lacy, she isn't just seeing a new couple. She's seeing evidence that he was capable of it the whole time. And that's where the third concept comes in, counterfactual thinking. Counterfactual thinking is our brain's compulsive habit of running what-if simulations. What if I had done something differently? What if I had been different? Why her and not me? Counterfactual thinking is normal. It's how the brain tries to learn from painful outcomes. But after a relationship ends, it can become a torture loop because the brain is trying to solve a problem that was never actually yours to solve. And that's the reframe I want to hand every listener sitting in Michelle's seat right now. His capacity showing up in a new relationship is not proof that you failed to unlock it. Relationships are systems, not vending machines. The same person in a different system at a different moment in his life, under different conditions, produces different behavior, which brings us to the psychology of why. Why does he chase her? The power of intermittent reinforcement. Now, I want to be careful here. We do not know what happens inside Jesse and Lacy's relationship, and we're not going to pretend we do. But viewers have noticed a dynamic worth talking about. Because whether or not it applies to this specific couple, it applies to relationships all over the world. And once you can name it, you'll see it everywhere. It's the dynamic where a person seems to pour endless effort, affection, and pursuit into a partner who gives attention back selectively. Warm one day, withholding the next, affection arriving in unpredictable doses. The term for what makes that dynamic so magnetically powerful is intermittent reinforcement. This comes straight from behavioral psychology from B.F. Skinner's research. Skinner discovered something counterintuitive. If you reward a behavior every time, the behavior is stable but unremarkable. But if you reward it unpredictably, sometimes yes, sometimes no, with no discernible pattern, the behavior becomes compulsive. It's the psychology of the slot machine. Nobody stands for 6 hours in front of a vending machine because the vending machine pays out every time. People stand for 6 hours in front of slot machines because the payout is random and the brain's dopamine system fires hardest not when we receive a reward, but when we anticipate an uncertain one. Now apply that to love. A partner who reliably adores you activates the brain's calm bonding systems. A partner who unpredictably adores you activates the brain's craving systems. The affection that comes in scarce, unpredictable doses feels more valuable. Not because it is, but because scarcity and uncertainty are neurological amplifiers. This is why some people appear to work hardest, chase hardest, and perform love most visibly for the partner who gives them the least consistent return, while the partner who gave steadily, who showed up, who built the business alongside them, who spoke kindly, who raised the child, somehow received the least pursuit. Consistent love, tragically, can become invisible to a nervous system that was trained somewhere along the way to equate love with earning. And here's where it connects to attachment. Attachment styles are the templates our nervous systems build in childhood about how love works. There's a well-documented pairing that researchers sometimes call the anxious avoidant trap. In this pairing, a person with more anxious attachment who soothes their fear of abandonment by pursuing, performing, and proving locks into a cycle with a person with more avoidant attachment who soothes their fear of engulfment by creating distance. The pursuer chases, the distancer retreats, and the retreat intensifies the chase. It's the same pursuer and distancer dynamic we saw in Jesse and Michelle's own marriage. Remember his words from season 1 of the show. Every time I take 6 steps forward, she takes 6 steps backward. The roles can rotate from relationship to relationship. The person who is distant in one relationship can become the desperate pursuer in the next, depending on which partner holds the scarcer currency. The dance is the constant. The positions are interchangeable. Today's conversation also overlaps with attachment theory, which we explored in depth during season 1 of Reality Case Studies in the episode, Why Didn't She Just Leave? Attachment, emotional safety, and the psychology of staying. If you're wondering why certain relationship dynamics feel so familiar, or why you repeatedly find yourself drawn to similar personalities, That episode is the natural companion to this one, and it's linked in the show notes. So when a listener asks me, why is he capable of it with her and he wasn't with me? One honest answer is this. It may not be capacity at all. It may be conditions. And chasing is not the same thing as loving. The confusion, when you did everything right and it still wasn't enough. I want to pause here and tell you what I see in my own practice, because this is not a reality television phenomenon. It is a Tuesday afternoon phenomenon. Week after week, someone sits across from me, and before we've even gotten to why they came in, they're describing some version of this exact scene. The wife who plans the date nights, manages the household, carries the invisible load, and cannot get her husband to reach for her hand, and who then watches him light up with charm the moment a neighbor walks over. The dad who spent years asking his own father for one word of approval and now can't understand why he keeps a mental tally of every compliment his boss doesn't give him. The mom of a neurodivergent kiddo who tells me, almost in passing, that she stopped asking her partner for help years ago because asking always turned into a fight about everything she'd ever done wrong. And here is what I want you to notice. Not one of these people comes in saying, I'm caught in a demand and withdraw a cycle, or I've resolved my cognitive dissonance through personalization. They come in saying the same 4 sentences in almost the same order every time. What's wrong with me? Why isn't it enough? Why can he do it for everyone but me? And quietest of all, am I crazy for still caring? They arrive carrying a verdict about themselves, and my job, before any strategy or any tool, is to help them see that the verdict was never a diagnosis of their worth. It was the residue of a pattern, usually one that started decades before this relationship existed. And this is the part that keeps me doing this work. The moment a person can finally name the pattern, watch it move, and see that it has a shape and a history and a predictable next step, something in their body changes. The confusion, which is often more exhausting than the pain itself, begins to lift, because you can't heal what you can't see. But once you can see it, you are no longer inside the fog. You are standing beside me, looking at it. That is the entire reason this series exists. So now look closely at Michelle's face in these scenes, because what you'll see there isn't only sadness, it's confusion, genuine bewilderment. And I want to honor that confusion, because for anyone who has lived it, it may be the most disorienting part of the entire experience. Here is the math her mind is trying to solve, and by her own account, it doesn't add up. I worked alongside you in real estate. I built a business with you. I gave you a daughter. I spoke kindly to you. I begged you, out loud, repeatedly, for physical affection. And you couldn't give it to me. Now I watch you give it away freely, effortlessly, to someone else. How is that possible? The first concept that explains what her brain is going through is cognitive dissonance, a term from psychologist Leon Festinger. Cognitive dissonance is the very real mental distress that happens when we hold 2 contradictory beliefs at the same time, and the brain cannot make them fit together. Michelle is holding 2 facts that both appear true and cannot coexist peacefully. Fact 1, he is fully capable of affection because I am watching it with my own eyes. Fact 2, he did not give it to me, even when I asked, even when I begged. The brain hates that contradiction. It itches. It demands resolution. And here is the dangerous part. The fastest, most available resolution, the one the mind reaches for almost automatically, is self-blame. Then something must be wrong with me. Psychologists have long observed that people often choose self-blame over confusion because, painful as it is, self-blame preserves a sense of control. If the problem was me, then at least the world makes sense, and at least I could have fixed it. Confusion offers no such comfort, so the mind trades accuracy for order, and the person who begged for love ends up carrying the verdict. That move has a clinical name, personalization. Personalization is one of the classic cognitive distortions identified in cognitive behavioral therapy, and it means assuming responsibility for an outcome you did not cause. Children of divorce do this constantly, quietly deciding that mom and dad split up because of something they did. Adults do the same thing in relationships. When affection is withheld, the withheld from partner almost never concludes. The withholding is about his internal world, his conditions, his dynamics. They conclude, I wasn't pretty enough, fun enough, easy enough, thin enough, relaxed enough. I want to say this clearly to every listener who has run that list at 2 in the morning. Personalization feels like insight, but it is a distortion. It is your brain resolving dissonance at your expense. There's a second framework that explains why this particular situation is so destabilizing, and it comes from equity theory, developed by psychologist John Stacey Adams. Equity theory says that people instinctively keep a fairness ledger in relationships. We track what we put in, called inputs, against what we receive, called outcomes, and we compare our ledger to the other person's. The research finding that matters here is that people don't just get upset when they receive too little. They become most distressed, most agitated, most consumed when the ledger appears wildly unbalanced compared to someone else's. Michelle's ledger, as she describes it, shows enormous inputs and starvation-level outcomes. Then she watches a relationship where, from the outside, the inputs appear smaller and the outcomes appear lavish. Her brain's fairness accounting system, which every one of us carries, essentially crashes. That crash is what confusion feels like from the inside. It's not weakness, and it's not obsession. It's an accounting system encountering numbers that violate its rules. And there's a third layer, the one that explains the begging itself. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness showed that when effort repeatedly fails to change an outcome, no matter how hard or how often we try, the nervous system eventually draws a devastating conclusion. My actions don't matter here. In a marriage, that looks like this progression. First you ask nicely, then you ask directly. Then you explain, then you plead, then you beg. And when begging changes nothing, something in you goes quiet. Not because the need disappeared, but because the nervous system learned that expressing it was pointless. This is one more reason for that flat expression we talked about earlier. And here is the sentence I most want you to take from this section. In a healthy relationship, you should never have to beg for affection. And the presence of begging is not evidence of a communication problem. Needing to beg is diagnostic information about the system itself. Begging means the asking already happened, clearly and repeatedly, and the system did not respond. So let's give Michelle's confusion, and yours if you've lived it, an honest answer. The missing variable was never her worth. Go back to what we learned about intermittent reinforcement and conditions. In a system where affection had become entangled with pursuit, scarcity, and control, her steadiness, her kindness, her availability were not deficiencies. They simply weren't the currency that particular system was trading in. The affection now flowing freely in a different relationship isn't proof that someone else earned what she couldn't. It's proof of what we said earlier. Same person, different system, different conditions, different behavior. Her ledger was never wrong. The marketplace was. And now, the turn we always make. Have you ever begged for something that should have been freely given? Affection, attention, acknowledgement, a simple kind word? And when it didn't come, what did you decide it meant about you? Sit with that question, because the conclusion you reached in that moment may still be running quietly in the background of every relationship you've had since. We'll pick that thread back up in the Path to Peace pause at the end of today's episode. The love language layer, when you know exactly what you need and still can't get it. Let's add another layer, because Michelle has essentially handed it to us on camera. Based on what she has shared on the show, physical affection and closeness clearly sit near the center of how she experiences love. If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know the framework of love languages from Gary Chapman's work. This is the idea that people tend to give and receive love through preferred channels, words of affirmation, quality time, physical touch, acts of service, and receiving gifts. Now, an honest caveat, because I always give you one. Love languages are a popular framework, not a clinical diagnostic tool, and researchers debate how well the 5-category model holds up empirically. But as a conversation starter, as a way of noticing that the way I naturally give love may not be the way my partner naturally receives it, it remains genuinely useful. And here's the part of the framework people miss. Your giving language and your receiving language can be different, and two people can love each other sincerely in languages the other one cannot hear. Michelle, by her own account, gave through partnership, loyalty, kind words, and building a life together, and needed touch and affection back. If the touch never came, it wouldn't matter how much was technically being given in other channels. Her nervous system would register starvation. That's not drama. That's not neediness. That's a mismatch in the delivery system of love. And it's one of the most common, most fixable, and most unfixed problems in couples. As Michelle described longing for more physical affection, it reminded me of a previous episode called Love Languages. Parenting in one love language, partnering in another. What's your love language? Today's conversation isn't intended to be a comprehensive explanation of that framework, because it deserves its own hour, and it has one. If you're not familiar with your own love language or the love languages of the people you care about, I encourage you to listen to that episode after today's discussion and take the free quiz with your partner tonight. Understanding the different ways people naturally give and receive love can completely change the way you interpret your closest relationships. You'll find it linked in today's show notes. Please don't do that in front of me. The anatomy of a healthy request. Now let's look at the second half of the scene, because this is where it becomes a masterclass. Michelle, by her account, asks Jesse for something specific. Please try not to be physically affectionate with her right in front of me. Not don't be happy, not don't be together, not don't bring her around, just not in front of me, not yet. Before we look at what Jesse did with that request, I want to slow down and examine the request itself, because what Michelle did in that moment is something psychology has a lot to say about, and most people, including the person making this kind of request, don't realize how much healthy work is packed inside it. First, let's name what this is. This is a boundary, and I want to define that term carefully, because it may be the most misused word in modern relationship conversations. A boundary is not a rule you impose on another person's behavior. A boundary is a statement about what you need in order to remain emotionally regulated and what you will do to protect yourself if that need can't be honored. Notice the difference. You're not allowed to date her would be a demand for control over his life. Please don't be physically affectionate with her directly in front of me while I'm still healing is a request about her own exposure, her own nervous system, her own recovery. She isn't trying to run his relationship. She's trying to manage what her own eyes and body have to absorb at a work event she cannot leave, because remember, this is also her job. In my work with families, I teach this distinction constantly. A boundary protects you, a demand controls them. Michelle's request lands squarely on the healthy side of that line. Second, let's talk about why she would need this boundary at all, because this is where the nervous system enters the story. When Michelle watches Jesse being affectionate with Lacy, her brain is not having a passive experience. It is having what psychologists call a trigger response, and I want to define that term properly because it gets thrown around loosely. A trigger is a present-day sight, sound, or situation that activates an old emotional wound, causing your body to respond to the past as if it were happening right now. The brain structure most responsible for this is the amygdala, the threat detection center I talk about often on this show. The amygdala doesn't keep a calendar. It doesn't know the divorce was finalized. It only knows pattern matching, this man, this affection, this ache. So when the affection she spent years asking for appears 10 feet away, directed at someone else, her body can flood with the full original grief in seconds. Psychologists call that state emotional flooding, which means the stress response has surged so strongly that the thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, temporarily goes offline. Heart racing, throat tightening, thoughts scrambling. You have felt this. Everyone has. It's why you can't just be logical in certain moments, no matter how intelligent you are. There's a related concept here called the window of tolerance, a term from psychiatrist Dan Siegel. Your window of tolerance is the zone in which your nervous system can handle stress and still function. You can think, speak, and stay present. Step outside that window and you tip into either hyperarousal, which looks like panic, anger, or tears, or hypoarousal, which looks like shutting down, going numb, going flat. Sound familiar? That flat, expressionless face viewers comment on. So when Michelle asks Jessie not to be affectionate in front of her, what she is actually saying in clinical translation is this: that specific sight pushes me outside my window of tolerance, in public, on camera, and I'm asking you to help me stay regulated while I heal. That is not weakness. That is remarkable self-awareness. Most people can't articulate their triggers at all. They just explode or disappear and can't tell you why. Third, and this is the piece I find genuinely impressive, making this request out loud is an act of what Bowen family systems theory calls differentiation of self. Differentiation is one of the central concepts in all of family systems work. So let me explain it in plain language. Differentiation is the ability to stay connected to other people while still holding on to your own feelings, needs, and identity, especially under pressure. A poorly differentiated person handles pain in one of two ways. They either fuse, meaning they collapse into the other person's reality and pretend they're fine to keep the peace, or they cut off, meaning they can't tolerate contact at all and disappear entirely. Think of the everyday versions. Fusing looks like the woman at Thanksgiving who smiles through her ex's new relationship, says, "No, really, I'm so happy for you both," and then cries in her car for an hour. Cutting off looks like the man who refuses to attend any event his ex might attend for years, reorganizing his entire life around avoidance. Michelle did neither. She stayed in the room, stayed in the co-parenting relationship, stayed on the show, and spoke a need out loud to the person most likely to dismiss it. Staying connected while stating a need is textbook differentiation, and it is hard. It is the thing therapists spend years helping clients build. And fourth, notice the small phrase tucked inside her request, "not yet." Those two words show something psychologists call self-compassion, which researcher Kristen Neff defines as treating yourself with the same patience you would offer a good friend, including allowing your healing to take the time it takes. "Not yet" acknowledges that this boundary is temporary scaffolding, not a permanent wall. She isn't claiming she'll never be able to witness their affection. She's saying her nervous system isn't there today, and she's giving herself permission for that to be okay. Compare that to what our culture usually demands of people after divorce, which is performed indifference. Prove you're over it, prove you don't care, laugh at the party. Michelle skipped the performance and told the truth about her capacity. In a clinical setting, we would call that healthy pacing of grief. So let's put the whole picture together. In one sentence at a cast party, Michelle demonstrated boundary setting rather than control, accurate identification of her own trigger, awareness of her window of tolerance, differentiation of self under real pressure, and self-compassionate pacing. 5 skills, 1 sentence. This is what I mean when I say the healthiest moments on reality television are usually the quietest ones, and they fly right past us because nobody yells, which makes what happens next so instructive. Because a request that healthy, delivered that clearly, should be easy to honor. It costs Jesse almost nothing. Save the affection for the other 95% of his life that Michelle doesn't have to witness. And instead, what does she get back? Essentially this: I had to watch you being lovey-dovey with your boyfriend, and I didn't say anything. I even screenshotted it. I want to slow down and name what just happened because it happens in living rooms everywhere, every day. First, that response is a deflection. Deflection is a defensive strategy in which a person avoids responding to what was actually raised by redirecting the conversation somewhere else. And its most common form is the counter-accusation, which means answering a request by bringing up something the other person once did. Psychologists also call this blame shifting, because the spotlight of responsibility gets physically moved from one person to the other in a single sentence. Watch how it works here. She asks for one thing. He responds with her history. Instead of responding to the request in front of him, the conversation is redirected to a counter-grievance. Notice what the deflection accomplishes. Her request is never actually answered. It doesn't get a yes. It doesn't get a no. It simply gets replaced by a debate about her past behavior. The original issue evaporates, and now she's the one defending herself. Second, when this pattern escalates, it can shade into what psychologist Jennifer Fried named DARVO, which stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. In a DARVO sequence, the person being asked for accountability denies there's an issue, attacks the person raising it, often targeting their tone, their timing, or their history, and finally reverses the roles so that they become the injured party. You're asking me not to hurt you becomes, actually, you hurt me. By the end of the conversation, the person who made the request is apologizing. If you have ever walked away from a conversation genuinely confused about how you started it asking for something and ended it defending yourself, you have likely experienced this pattern. Naming it is the beginning of neutralizing it. And third, and this is subtle, keeping receipts is worth noticing as a relational posture. Screenshotting a moment and holding it in reserve is evidence gathering. And evidence gathering is what people do when they're preparing for a trial, not a relationship. When conflict in a family system shifts from let's solve this to let's build a case, the system has stopped fighting for the relationship and started fighting about the narrative. There's one more layer to name here, and it requires extra care because it's about motive. And motive is the one thing footage can never prove. But viewers keep circling a question that deserves an honest answer. What if he isn't just deflecting? What if some part of him is enjoying this? Remember the history he himself points to. She ended the marriage. She moved on first. He says he had to watch her being affectionate with her new boyfriend, and he stayed silent, and he kept the screenshots. So now, when her turn comes to ask for mercy, the refusal arrives with something that reads as coldness, and some viewers see something more than coldness. Psychology has names for what they might be seeing, so let's learn them, while holding firmly to our rule. We are describing patterns that exist in the world, not claiming to know what lives inside anyone on our screens. The first term is Schadenfreude. It's a German word that psychology borrowed because English never made one of its own, and it means the experience of pleasure at another person's discomfort or misfortune. Everyone has felt a flicker of it. It's why blooper reels exist. But research shows Schadenfreude intensifies under 3 specific conditions. When we envy the person, when we believe their suffering is deserved, and when their pain feels like justice for pain they caused us. Now notice something. A divorce in which someone felt left, replaced, and forced to watch checks all 3 boxes. So when a person seems faintly satisfied while their ex winces, that isn't usually cruelty invented from nothing. It's Schadenfreude riding on a story of deservingness. You did this to me first. The story makes the pleasure feel like fairness instead of unkindness, which is exactly why the person feeling it rarely recognizes it as a problem. The second concept brings back equity theory, the fairness ledger we learned about earlier. Researchers have found that when people feel wronged in a relationship, they don't only grieve or withdraw. Some of them restore the ledger through retaliation, deliberately or half-consciously, making the other person feel the loss they felt. In plain language, it's payback. I had to watch you, so now you have to watch me. Viewed through that lens, affection performed in front of an ex isn't only affection, it's an invoice. And here's the piece that makes payback so hard to confront. The person doing it genuinely experiences it as justice, not aggression, because in their accounting, the books were unbalanced, and this merely evens them. The third term is jealousy induction, and this one has been directly studied by relationship researchers. Jealousy induction is the deliberate display of affection or attention toward one person in order to provoke a reaction in someone watching. The defining feature is that the display is aimed at the audience, not the partner. Now, I want to be honest. From the outside, affectionate behavior and jealousy induction can look identical, and often affection is simply affection. But there is one behavioral test that separates them, and it's the very test this scene hands us. Affection that exists for the partner costs nothing to relocate out of an ex's sightline. You simply save it for the other 95% of your life. Affection that exists for the audience cannot be relocated because the audience is the point. So when a modest request to move the display elsewhere is met not with, "Sure, that's easy," but with Darvo and a receipt from the past, that refusal is at minimum consistent with the display having an audience. I'll let you sit with that. And the callousness itself, the flat dismissal of her pain as unworthy of even basic consideration, has a name in couples research: contempt. John Gottman identified contempt as the single most corrosive communication pattern a relationship can contain, the strongest predictor of relational breakdown in his research, because contempt is delivered from a position of superiority. It says, "Your pain doesn't merit my adjustment." Criticism attacks what you did. Contempt dismisses what you are. If you have ever been on the receiving end of a payback dynamic, you know the most disorienting part isn't the coldness itself. It's being handed a reason for it. You're told, in words or in posture, that you deserve this, that your hurt is simply the bill for hurt you caused. And because you're a person of conscience, you take the bill seriously. You audit yourself. Maybe I did do this. Maybe this is fair. So let me offer you the distinction that matters. Accountability is owed for harm you caused, and it's paid through honest conversation and repair. It is never legitimately collected through your ongoing suffering. Anyone whose sense of justice requires watching you hurt is not balancing a ledger. They're feeding something, and you are not obligated to be the meal. Why asking directly can seem to make it worse. Here's the piece of this that haunts people, and I promised you we'd get to it. Michelle did the thing every therapist tells you to do. She used her words. She named her need directly, and it appears to have gotten her less than nothing. Two concepts explain this. The first is the demand and withdraw pattern, one of the most heavily researched destructive cycles in couples literature. One partner raises an issue or makes a request. The demand, and even a gentle one, counts, and the other partner responds by withdrawing, going silent, deflecting, leaving, stonewalling. The more one demands, the more the other withdraws. The more one withdraws, the more urgent the demands become. Decades of research, much of it by John Gottman and others, links entrenched demand and withdrawal cycles to relationship deterioration. The second is psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is the tendency, first described by psychologist Jack Brame, to resist doing something specifically because we feel our freedom is being constrained by the request. In healthy people, reactance is a flicker. Think of a toddler who suddenly doesn't want the cup once you insist on it. But in an unhealthy relational dynamic, especially one where control and power have become the underlying currency of the relationship, a direct request can function as a guarantee of refusal. Giving you what you asked for would mean, in that person's internal accounting, that you directed their behavior. And if the relationship has become a contest about who directs whom, your stated need becomes the one thing they cannot grant without feeling they've lost. This is one of the cruelest inversions in unhealthy systems. The healthier and more direct your communication becomes, the less you receive, and then you're told the problem is that you're needy for asking. Let me say this plainly to every listener who needs it. In a healthy relationship, stating a need increases the odds of it being met. If, in your relationship, stating a need reliably decreases those odds, that is diagnostic information about the system, not about the legitimacy of your need. The fog. Gaslighting by accumulation. There's one more piece of the emotional landscape here, and it explains something viewers comment on constantly. Why Michelle sometimes appears flat, cold, or unmoved on camera in moments where you'd expect emotion. Gaslighting, a term drawn from the 1944 film Gaslight, is a form of psychological manipulation in which a person is led to doubt their own perception, memory, or sanity. But here's what people misunderstand about it. Gaslighting in real relationships is rarely one single denial. It's the accumulation of hundreds of small reality distortions over time. That's not what I said. That never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're being dramatic. Why are you so sensitive? Each individual instance is small enough to be deniable, small enough that you'd feel ridiculous fighting about it. But each one chips away at your confidence in your own mind. And here's the devastating downstream effect. After enough accumulation, your eventual reaction, whether it's the tears, the raised voice, the shutdown, or the flat expressionless face, looks unprovoked and disproportionate to anyone who hasn't been living inside the fog with you. The audience sees one moment, you lived 1,000. What reads as coldness on a screen is very often what self-protection looks like after a nervous system has been blindsided too many times to keep performing surprise, and now you have the clinical language for it. That flatness is hypoarousal, a nervous system dropping below its window of tolerance because staying fully present has become too costly. And if the fog I just described felt less like television and more like your own living room, please know I've created an entire episode called Walking on Eggshells. How narcissistic abuse rewires your nervous system and how to heal from it. It pairs with two others, dark psychology and manipulation, how to recognize it before it costs you more, and is your anxiety baseline too high? Here's how to tell and how to fix it. If your nervous system has been living on high alert, those 3 episodes belong together, and they're all linked in the show notes. We're going to dedicate a full episode later this season to the Accountability Avoidance Toolkit, strategically timed tears, Darvo in depth, and hoovering, which is the pattern of pulling someone back into a dynamic just as they begin to detach. Today, I wanted you to have the foundation. Bringing it home. Where did you learn how love is earned? Now we do what we always do in reality case studies. We turn the camera around. Because here is the deeper truth underneath everything we covered today. Nobody arrives in adulthood with a random relationship style. The chase, the scarcity, the earning, the withholding. These are learned. Attachment theory calls them internal working models, which are the unconscious blueprints about love, worth, and safety that your nervous system drafted in childhood, long before you had words. And Bowen family systems theory teaches that we don't just inherit eye color from our families. We inherit emotional patterns, and those patterns repeat across generations until someone becomes aware enough to choose differently. So I want you to sit with this as you move through your week. Don't judge what comes up. Just notice. Think about your father or the father figures in your life. How was love expressed there? Was it steady and freely given, or was it something you performed for? Did his approval arrive predictably or in unpredictable doses that kept you auditioning? When he was proud of you, how did you know? And when he was disappointed, Did the warmth disappear along with the approval? For many of us, a father's love was the first place we learned whether affection is a constant or a wage. Now, your mother, or the mother figures, and I want to give this its own space, because in attachment research, the mother or primary caregiver is usually the first attachment figure a child ever has, the first nervous system we ever borrow. Psychologists call that borrowing co-regulation. An infant cannot calm its own body, so it learns calm by syncing with a caregiver's calm thousands of times, years before memory begins. Your mother was also most likely your first mirror. Mirroring is the process by which a caregiver reflects a child's emotions back to them, teaching the child that feelings are real, nameable, and survivable. So ask yourself, when you were upset as a child, what did your mother do with your feelings? Did she comfort you, dismiss you, punish you? Or did she become so upset herself that you ended up comforting her? If it was that last one, you were experiencing parentification, the role reversal in which a child becomes the emotional caretaker of the parent, and it shapes adult relationships more than almost any other childhood pattern because it teaches you that love means managing someone else's feelings while your own wait quietly in line. Was her warmth constant or was it conditional, tied to your behavior, your achievements, your ability to keep her happy? Did closeness with her feel safe, or did closeness always arrive with obligation? Psychologists call that second experience enmeshment, a blurring of emotional boundaries where a child's job becomes managing a parent's inner world, and where love and duty become impossible to tell apart. Now zoom out to the household itself. Was love in your home oriented around people-pleasing, keeping the peace, reading the room, earning warmth through goodness? Was it competitive, with siblings or even parents vying for attention, love treated as a scarce resource with winners and losers? When you needed affection as a child, did you ask directly? And if you asked, did asking work? Or did you learn early that stated needs get denied, so wanting must be hidden? If today's conversation has you thinking about your own childhood and the ways your parents expressed affection, approval, discipline, or emotional availability, I have an episode that takes a much deeper dive called 4 Parenting Styles, explained, which one is running your home? Understanding whether you were raised in an authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, or neglectful environment often provides remarkable insight into the expectations and relationship patterns we carry into adulthood. And for the bigger picture of how entire families pass patterns from one generation to the next, the blueprint for a happy family, building a thriving family system, and the butterfly effect in family systems therapy pair beautifully with today's discussion. All of them are in the show notes. And if the mother figure questions touch something deeper, I have 2 episodes that go much further. The narcissistic mother, understanding the invisible wounds she left behind, and parentification, when kids become the adults in the room. Both are in the show notes. And I want to leave you with the idea that ties it all together. The chaser. Are you most alive, most devoted, most effortful with the people who give you the least consistent return? Does steady, available love feel, be honest, a little boring to your nervous system, while unpredictable love feels like passion? If so, I want you to hear this with all the compassion I have. That is not a character flaw. That is a nervous system faithfully running the program it was handed. Intermittent reinforcement didn't start with your partner. For many of us, it started at the kitchen table. And the encouraging news, the news this entire podcast is built on, is that nervous systems remain teachable for life. The clinical term is neuroplasticity. The lived experience is called doing something different, one small repetition at a time, until steady love stops feeling foreign and starts feeling like home. The path to peace pause. Here are the 2 questions I want you to carry with you this week. Question 2. Think of the last time you stated a need directly to someone you love. What happened next? Did stating your need bring you closer to getting it or further away? And what does that answer tell you about the system you're living in? Think of reality case studies as the doorway. Once we've introduced a concept through a reality TV example, you can continue learning by exploring the deeper episodes in my library of over 160 episodes. Next time on Reality Case Studies, Season 2, Episode 2, The Roommate Marriage: How Two People Can Live in the Same House and Slowly Disappear from Each Other. We'll explore emotional disengagement, the pursue and withdraw cycle, and the quiet way intimacy dies through accumulation rather than explosion. And we'll go back to the beginning of Jesse and Michelle's story to watch how it happened one ordinary day at a time. One more time, because it is very important to remember, this episode is educational. It is not a psychological evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment recommendation for anyone featured, and it is not a substitute for professional mental health care. If this episode's themes are ones you're living, please reach out to a licensed professional in your area. You can find every episode, the companion journal on Patreon, and more at thepathtopeacetherapy.com, and you can follow me on Instagram at thepathtopeacetherapy. Take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, understanding the patterns is the first step. Practicing something healthier is what changes the story. You got this, and I've got you.